The last thing Mary Ingalls ever saw she did not know was the last thing. That is how it happens. With this kind of blindness, there is no warning. There is no final sunset she might have memorized, if only she had known to look a little harder. There was just a fever, a terrible fever, in the spring of 1879, that burned through a 14-year-old girl in a small house on the Dakota prairie until the people who loved her were afraid it was going to kill her. And when at last it broke, and the worst of it seemed to pass, and everyone let themselves begin to hope that she would live, that was the moment they understood that the fever had taken something it was never going to give back. Mary could not see the doctor's face. She could not see her mother bending over the bed. She could not see the window, or the daylight coming through it, or her own 2 hands held up in front of her eyes. The fever was gone. So was the world. And she was 14 years old. She would live another 49 years. 49 years. From that darkened room in 1879 to her final breath in 1928, very nearly half a century, every single day of it, in the dark. And here is the strange and important thing, the thing this whole story turns on. Almost everything you think you know about those 49 years is wrong. If you grew up with Little House on the Prairie, the books, or, more likely, the television show, then you carry a picture in your mind of what became of Mary Ingalls, the blind girl who triumphed, who went away to a special school and fell in love and married a handsome blind teacher named Adam, and built a life with him and had a baby. You may even remember the terrible thing that happened to that baby. It is a beautiful, sad, deeply satisfying story, and almost none of it is true. There was no Adam. There was no wedding. There was no child. The real Mary Ingalls never married anyone. She never had a baby. She never taught at a school, never regained her sight, never moved away to the city to begin a shining new life. The people who made the television show invented all of it. Every bit of that romance, and that rescue, and that heartbreak. And tonight I want to ask you why they felt they had to. Because the answer has very little to do with Mary, and a great deal to do with the rest of us. With what we are willing to look at, and what we would much rather not. So here is the question I want you to carry the whole way through this. The one I am not going to answer for you. Was the real life of Mary Ingalls, blind, unmarried, living out her decades in her family's houses, a small and shrunken and quietly sorrowful thing, a life the world made narrow because of what she could not do? Or was it, in its own unglamorous, unapplauded, unfilmed way, a kind of triumph that simply nobody thought to build a story around? A tragedy, or a victory? By the end, you're going to have to decide for yourself. I won't do it for you. And hold on to 2 more things beside that question, because I am going to come back to all 3, and each time I do, it will land a little harder than the time before. Hold on to the number, 49 years in the dark. As we go, keep a quiet count of what a human being can build across 49 years when there is no one watching and no reward waiting at the end of it. And hold on to a little sister. Because in the weeks after Mary lost her sight, her father said a few words to her younger sister, a restless, impatient girl named Laura, that would go on to change the history of American storytelling. He told Laura to be Mary's eyes, to look hard at the world and to describe it out loud so that Mary, who could no longer see any of it, might somehow be given it anyway, in words. And that little girl, learning day after day to turn everything she saw into language for a sister who could not see, that little girl grew up to write the most beloved books about the American frontier that have ever been written. Hold on to that. We are nowhere near done with it. We begin before the dark. We begin with the girl Mary was while she could still see, and with the quiet, golden, almost unfair perfection that would make everything that came afterwards so much crueler. Mary Amelia Ingalls was born in January of 1865 in the woods of western Wisconsin, the first child of Charles and Caroline Ingalls. She was the eldest. She was, from the very beginning, the good one. If you have read the Little House books, you already know exactly the kind of girl I mean, because Laura, who wrote them, could not help drawing her sister with a faint, lifelong sting of envy threaded through every line. Mary was the obedient one, the patient one, the one with the smooth golden hair that fell in proper curls, while Laura's was a plain and stubborn brown. Mary sat still when she was told to sit still. Mary kept her pinafore clean. Mary learned her lessons without complaint and remembered them perfectly, and never ever ran off barefoot to do the wild things that her younger sister could not stop herself from doing. Mary was held up gently and constantly as the example, and Laura, who loved her, and who also could have shaken her, spent her childhood being measured against a sister who always seemed to come out ahead without even trying. It is worth being honest about this, because it makes what is coming so much more painful. The two sisters were not interchangeable. Mary was genuinely the family's quiet pride, the bright, careful, well-behaved eldest daughter that every striving frontier family hoped for. Her future, as far as anyone could see, was the safest and most settled of all the children's. She would grow up good and grow up clever, and one day surely she would teach school or marry well, or both. Of all the Ingalls girls, Mary was the one whose path looked the straightest. And then, in 1879, when she was 14, the fever came. I'm not going to spend long on the illness itself, because the cause of it is its own tangled story, and the short version is this. For more than a century, the family's own account, the one written into the books, held that Mary went blind from scarlet fever. In our own time, doctors and researchers who went back through the records came to believe it was almost certainly something else. An inflammation of the brain, a viral assault on the nerves, the kind of thing that in 1879 on the prairie had no name anyone could use and no treatment anyone could offer. Whatever it was, it burned through her, and it spared her life, and it took her sight, slowly and then completely, until the girl who had always seen everything clearly could see nothing at all. Try, for one moment, to stand inside that. Not the fever, the after, 14 years old, the age when a girl is just beginning to imagine the shape of her own future, the dances, the courting, the someday. And in the space of a few weeks, every one of those pictures goes dark all at once and stays dark. The future that had looked straighter than anyone simply closed like a door, and there was no surgery that could open it, no specialist a poor homesteading family could carry her to, no hope anyone could honestly hold out. The doctors confirmed it as gently as they could. Mary was blind, she would not see again. For a family that had already survived so much, the moving, the failures, the lean and frightening years I have told elsewhere, this was a different kind of blow, because it could not be outrun or outworked or fixed by moving on to the next place. It was permanent. It had moved into the house, and it was going to stay. And in those first dark weeks, with the whole family stunned and grieving and frightened for what would become of their eldest girl, something happened that nobody planned and nobody could have predicted. Something that would, in the end, reach far beyond that little house and that family and that century. It began with a sentence from Mary's father, and it was aimed not at Mary at all, but at her restless, brown-haired, ordinary younger sister. Charles Ingalls told Laura to see for Mary. That was the whole of it, more or less. Look, he told her, really look, and then tell your sister what you see. Don't just say there is a river. Tell her how the water moves and what colour it is in the light, and how fast it runs and what it sounds like over the stones. Don't just say the prairie, give it to her. Make her see it without her eyes. It sounds like a small thing, a kindness, a way to keep a blind girl connected to a world she could no longer look at. And it was that. But it was also, without anyone intending it, an apprenticeship. The strangest and most consequential apprenticeship in the history of American letters. Because think about what it actually asked of Laura day after day, year after year. To be someone's eyes is not to glance. It is to attend. It is to stop and notice and find the exact words for a thing, and then test those words against the impossible standard of a sister who would never be able to check them against the real view, and who therefore needed them to be true. Laura could not be lazy about it. A vague description was useless to Mary. A precise one was a gift. So Laura learned, slowly and under the most loving kind of pressure, to look at the world harder than other people look at it, and to carry it across the gap between them in language clear enough and vivid enough that a blind girl could walk into the picture and stand there. She was training, though she did not know it, to be a writer. The exact muscle that a great descriptive writer needs, the ability to make a reader see a place they have never been, to put the smell of a prairie spring or the white silence of a Dakota blizzard directly into a stranger's mind. Laura built that muscle as a child, lifting the same weight over and over because her sister had gone blind and someone had to be her eyes. Hold that thought against this fact and feel how heavy it is. Decades later, Laura Ingalls Wilder would sit down as an old woman and write a handful of books about her pioneer childhood. Books that have never gone out of print, that have been read aloud at millions of bedsides, that taught generations of children all over the world what the American frontier looked like and smelled like and felt like. When you picture the big woods, or the long grass of the open prairie, or the snug warmth of a little house against the winter, you're seeing it through Laura's words. And Laura's words were shaped, first and most deeply, in the work of describing the world to a sister who could not see it. The most vivid pictures of the American frontier that exist anywhere were painted, in a sense, for a blind woman, by her sister, so that she would not be left entirely in the dark. I told you to hold on to the little sister. This is why. We will come back to it at the very end, and when we do, I want you to remember that it started here, in a grieving house in 1879, with a father's quiet instruction and a blind girl's need, long before anyone dreamed there would ever be books at all. But that is Laura's part of the story, and Laura, in the end, got the whole world. Mary's part was harder and quieter, and almost nobody has ever told it honestly. And it begins not with triumph, and not yet with the cruelty of the wider world, but in a small dark room, with a 14-year-old girl learning day after day the hardest lesson of her life, how to live without the light at all. Before we follow Mary out into the world, stay with her for a moment in the dark of those first years, because almost no one ever does, and it is the part of her life that asks the most of our imagination. She did not go blind all at once, and then simply get used to it. The adjustment was its own long private ordeal, and it happened in a small frontier house with no specialists, no counsellors, no one who had any idea how to help a sighted girl become a blind woman. There was only the family, and time, and Mary herself, feeling her way, quite literally was into a completely altered life. Think of what changes when the light goes out and does not come back. Every ordinary thing in a house becomes a question. Where is the doorway? How many steps to the table? Is the kettle hot? Did someone move the chair? A sighted person solves 1,000 of these questions a minute without ever knowing they are doing it. A newly blind person has to solve each one deliberately, by memory and by touch and by listening, until slowly the solving becomes habit and the house becomes knowable again. Not seen, but mapped, held in the mind and the fingertips instead of the eyes. Mary had to build that map of her whole world from nothing, room by room, object by object, in darkness at 14. And it was not only the practical things. There was grief in it. Real grief. The kind that does not announce itself but settles in and stays. A girl that age is full of looking. She looks at herself, at how she is growing. She looks at the boys and the dances just coming onto her horizon. She looks ahead, constantly, at the life she's going to have. All of that looking was simply gone, and with it a particular kind of girlhood she would never get to live. The mirror was useless to her now. So were the daydreams that begin with imagining how you appear to others. We do not know how much Mary let herself feel the loss of those things, because she was, by every account, a contained and uncomplaining person. But she was a person. It was there. What we do know is that the world rearranged itself around her, and that she rearranged herself around the world, and that both took time. Her senses sharpened, the way they do, her hearing, her touch, her memory all quietly taking up the work her eyes had laid down. She learned to know people by their footsteps and their voices, to know rooms by their echoes and their draughts. to do with her hands what she had once done with a glance. Sound became a kind of sight. The creak of a particular board, the direction of a voice, the warmth of the stove on one cheek telling her which way she was facing. These became her instruments for moving through a world she could no longer look at. And through all of it, there was Laura describing, being her eyes. The two sisters fell into the rhythm that I told you about. Laura turning the visible world into words, Mary receiving it. And that rhythm was, in those first dark years, one of the threads that kept Mary tied to the life going on around her. She could not see the prairie, but she could have it, second hand, in her sister's voice. It was not the same, but it was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. For about 2 years this was Mary's life, a blind girl at home on the Dakota prairie, learning the patient, invisible skills of living without sight, with no school to go to and no future anyone could promise her. The family had heard of no place that could help. As far as they knew, this quiet, mapped second-hand life was simply what Mary's life was going to be, from now until the end. A girl in a chair, in a house, in the dark. She would have years to learn those patient skills. But her first true test of living in the dark did not wait for years. It came that very winter, and it came harder than anything the family had faced before, because the season now closing in on the Dakota prairie would become the stuff of legend, the worst winter the settlers there would ever know. And Mary would have to face every month of it without being able to see a single day. They would call it, ever afterward, the long winter, and of everyone who lived through it, almost no one experienced it the way Mary did, because Mary went through the worst winter the Dakota prairie has ever recorded without being able to see a single moment of it. It began in October of 1880, far too early, with a blizzard that came roaring down out of the north before the autumn was rightly over. And then it simply did not stop. Storm after storm for 7 months, blizzards rolling in every few days with hardly a clear stretch between them, until the little town of De Smet, where the Ingalls family was now living, was buried and cut off from the rest of the world. The snow piled higher than the houses. It blocked the railroad tracks so completely and so repeatedly that the trains stopped coming altogether. No trains meant no coal, no kerosene, no flour, no supplies of any kind. The town was on its own, sealed inside the winter for months. Now think about what a blizzard is, to a person who cannot see. For everyone else, a prairie blizzard is first of all a thing you watch. The world erased into white, the air turned solid with snow, the windows gone blank. Mary saw none of that. For Mary, the long winter was not white. It was sound and cold and hunger and waiting. It was the endless scream of the wind against the walls, hour after hour, day after day, a sound that did not let up and did not let you forget where you were. It was the cold pressing in through every crack as the fuel ran low. It was the particular helplessness of being shut inside a small dark house, inside a storm she could not look at, inside a body that could not see, a darkness within a darkness within a darkness. When the coal ran out, the family did what the whole town did. They burned hay. There was no wood and no coal to be had, so they twisted slough hay into tight hard sticks and fed those into the stove, one after another, because loose hay burns away in an instant. It was endless work for almost no warmth. Twist and burn and twist again, all day, just to keep from freezing. And here is something we can say about Mary with real confidence. This was work she could do. Twisting hay does not require sight. It requires hands and patience and the willingness to keep going at a dull, cold, repetitive task hour after hour, and those were things Mary had. In a house where every pair of hands was needed simply to survive, the blind daughter was not a burden set in the corner. She could work. She almost certainly did. When the food ran out, it was the same grim story. With no trains and no flour, the family ground seed wheat, the wheat that was supposed to be saved for spring planting, in a little coffee mill by hand, turning the crank over and over to make a coarse brown bitter flour, just enough for a day's hard bread. Turning that mill was another task that asked nothing of the eyes. Picture it. The family taking turns at the coffee mill in the freezing half-dark, grinding tomorrow's only food a handful at a time, the wind howling outside and Mary among them, taking her turn at the crank, doing her share of the work of staying alive. She could not see how little was left in the bin. She could only feel the crank and hear the wind and be hungry like everyone else, and keep turning. By the end of that winter, the town was genuinely starving, down to almost nothing, and it was saved only because two young men, one of them Almanzo Wilder, who would one day marry Mary's sister Laura, made a desperate trip out across the frozen prairie, risking their lives in the brief gap between storms to find a settler rumoured to be holding a stock of wheat, and brought it back so the town could eat. The trains did not break through until spring. 7 months. Mary endured every week of it in the dark, and I want you to sit with what that took, because it is easy to skip past. We tell the long winter as a story of pioneers against the storm, and we picture them squinting out at the white, watching the snow, seeing the danger. Mary could do none of that. She could not watch for a break in the weather. She could not see how thin her family was getting, or how frightened her parents looked, or how low the wheat in the bin had fallen. She lived inside that long, killing winter as pure sensation and pure faith. The sound of the wind, the ache of the cold, the gnawing of hunger, and the voices of the people she loved telling her, day after day, that they would get through. She had no way to see whether that was true. She had only their word and her own steadiness, and the hay to twist and the mill to turn. She survived it. The young blind girl, 15 when it began, 16 before it ended, survived the worst winter the settlers of that country would ever know, doing her share, asking for no special mercy, enduring in the dark what the others at least got to face with open eyes. But surviving, she was about to learn, was not the same thing as having a future. She had lived through the winter, and waiting on the far side of it was the rest of her life, and a world that had already made up its mind that a blind girl had no life worth speaking of at all. To understand what Mary Ingalls actually did with her life, you first have to understand what the world expected her to do with it, and the honest answer is nothing. In 1879, in America, to go blind was, for most people, to disappear. Not to die, to disappear. The world had a settled, unspoken verdict about the blind, and the verdict was that they were finished. A blind person was assumed to be a permanent dependent, someone who could not work, could not earn, could not run a household, could not marry, could not be anything other than a person other people had to take care of for as long as they lived. Pity was the kindest thing on offer. Below the pity was something colder, the quiet arithmetic of a family or a town deciding what to do with a member who, it was assumed, would now only ever take and never give. For those with money and loving families, that meant a sheltered life at home, cared for, provided for, but set quietly to one side, out of the current of ordinary life. For those without money or family, it could mean far worse. The poorhouse, the county asylum, the institutions where the 19th century swept the people it had decided it could not use. A blind woman especially was thought to have almost no future of her own. Marriage was considered out of the question. Who, the thinking went, would take on a wife who could not see to keep a house? Work was considered out of the question. Independence was simply not imagined. The expectation, top to bottom, was that a blind girl's life was effectively over at the moment the light went out, and that everything after was a kind of waiting. Now lay that expectation over a 14-year-old on a Dakota homestead. Mary had been the bright one, the one whose future looked surest, the daughter most likely to teach, to marry, to make something of herself. And in a matter of weeks the world had reclassified her. She was no longer the promising eldest daughter. She was, in the eyes of the age, a dependent, a sorrow, a girl with no road in front of her, and she would have known it. She was not a child. She was old enough to understand exactly what blindness was supposed to mean, and to feel the future she had assumed quietly being taken down off the wall, picture by picture. For the family, the weight of it was real, and it was heavy, and I am not going to pretend otherwise out of sentiment. The Ingalls family was poor. They had spent years one bad harvest away from disaster, and now they faced the prospect of a beloved daughter who, by every assumption of the time, would need to be cared for and supported for the rest of her natural life. Decades, perhaps, with no way to ever contribute to her own keep. That is not a small thing for a struggling family. It would have frightened them, it would have grieved them, and underneath the love, it would have settled onto them as a lifelong responsibility with no end in sight. That was the verdict. That was the future the world was prepared to allow Mary Ingalls. A quiet corner, a kind enough captivity, a life lived entirely in the past tense. And this is the part of the story I most want you to hold against everything that comes next. Because Mary Ingalls was about to spend the following half-century, patiently and without complaint, proving that verdict wrong, not loudly, not in a way anyone made a film about, but thoroughly. She was about to learn to read again, to write again, to make music, to make things with her hands that people would pay money for, to hold a place in a community for 30 years, to become, against every expectation of her age, a woman who gave at least as much as she took. It started with a stranger passing through, and a piece of news that cracked the closed door open just wide enough to let a little light in. The news came, as so much news did on the frontier, from a traveller. A missionary passing through the Dakota country told the Ingalls family about a place they had never heard of, a school, far away in Iowa, in a town called Vinton, that existed for exactly one purpose: to teach blind people how to live, not to warehouse them, not to pity them, to educate them. The Iowa College for the Blind taught its students to read and write by touch, to do useful work, to carry themselves through the world with something the age did not think the blind could ever have again: independence. For a family that had quietly assumed Mary's future was a closed book, this was an astonishing idea. There was a place where blindness was not the end of the story, where a girl like Mary could be given back some of what the fever had taken, not her sight, but the things underneath it: competence, confidence, a way to contribute, a reason to hope. But wanting it and reaching it were two different things, and the distance between them was money and miles. The cost of such an education was far beyond what a homesteading family scraping by on the Dakota prairie could ever have paid on its own. What made it possible in the end was that the Dakota Territory would fund the schooling of a blind student from its lands, and so a door that the family could never have opened with its own hands was opened for them. Even then it asked something of them that we should not skip past lightly. It asked them to let her go. Think about that. Mary had been blind for 2 years. She had been kept close, cared for, watched over inside the safety of the family, and now they were going to put their blind daughter on a train and send her hundreds of miles away to a strange institution in another territory, full of strangers, to live among people none of them knew, for years at a time. For a girl who could not see, every unfamiliar room is a maze and every stranger is a voice without a face. The courage it took for Mary to go and for Caroline and Charles to let her is its own quiet thing, and it deserves to be named. In November of 1881, at the age of 16, Mary Ingalls was enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind, and the life that the world had declared finished quietly began again. What she learned there changed everything. She learned Braille, the system of raised dots that let a blind person read with their fingertips, and with it, the written word came back to her. The girl who had loved her lessons, who had been the studious one, the bright one, was no longer locked out of books and letters. She could read again. She could write again. She could, in the most literal sense, see words once more with her hands. She learned music. Mary became a capable organist, genuinely skilled, not as a sad consolation but as a real accomplishment, and music became a thread that would run through the rest of her life, all the way to its end. She learned needlework and fine beadwork and sewing, and the making of things like the nets that protected horses from flies. Practical, sellable handcraft that meant her hands could earn. She learned the domestic skills that would let her hold a real place in a household, rather than merely occupy a chair in it. And alongside all of it, she learned the ordinary academic subjects, and she learned them well. The school's own records remembered her in a small, telling way. Mary Ingalls was never a behaviour problem. In an institution where plenty of homesick, frustrated young people pushed against the rules, Mary kept the same quiet steadiness she'd carried since she was the good daughter in the big woods. The fever had taken her sight. It had not touched who she was. And here is the thing the school gave her that mattered most of all, more than the braille or the music or the beadwork. It gave her back her confidence. It gave her proof, daily, physical proof, that she was not the helpless dependent the world had written her down as. She could learn. She could make. She could manage. The verdict had been wrong, and she now had 8 years of evidence that it was wrong. She stayed until 1889. And in June of that year, at the age of 24, Mary Ingalls graduated, one of just 8 students in her class, 5 young women and 3 young men, all of them having come up out of the same darkness and learned to live anyway. At the commencement, Mary stood up in front of everyone and recited a piece by the Scottish poet Robert Burns. Its title was an old Scots phrase that meant, roughly, wait a little while and do not grow weary. Hold that phrase. Bide a wee and dinna weary. Wait a while and do not grow tired. A blind young woman who had every reason in the world to be weary, who had been told her life was over at 14, stood at her graduation and spoke those words out loud, and then went home to live them, quietly, for the next 39 years. We will come back to that phrase at the very end. It turns out to be the truest thing anyone ever said about her. So, the girl the world had given up on came home from Iowa, educated, literate, musical, capable, and changed. She had beaten the verdict. And waiting for her back in Dakota was the real life. The long, unfilmed, unrewarded, genuine life that the television cameras would one day refuse to show and replace with a fairy tale. But before we follow her home to that life, and to the strange fairy tale the world would one day tell about it, there is something worth stopping on. Because the school that gave Mary back her future did not fall out of the sky. It existed because of a long and stubborn fight, waged by people she never met over a single question, whether a person like Mary was worth teaching at all. It is worth stopping to ask a question the Ingalls family probably never thought to ask because the answer is part of Mary's story whether she knew it or not. Why did a school like the one in Iowa exist at all, in a century that had largely written the blind off as hopeless, who decided that blind children could be taught, and fought to build the places that would teach them? The answer is that Mary Ingalls was the beneficiary of a long, stubborn battle that had been going on for half a century before she ever lost her sight, fought by people whose names she likely never learned. For most of human history, the prevailing belief had been brutally simple. The blind could not be educated. Reading was done with the eyes. The eyes were gone. Therefore the mind behind them was, for all practical purposes, sealed shut. A blind person could be fed and sheltered and pitied, but not taught, not developed, not made into anything. That was the settled wisdom. And in the early 1800s, a handful of reformers in Europe and then America set out to prove it wrong. In America, the great name was Samuel Gridley Howe, who in the late 1820s founded in Boston the school that would become known as Perkins, the first serious institution in the country devoted to educating the blind. And Howe did something that stunned the world. He took on a child named Laura Bridgman, a little girl who was not only blind but also deaf, cut off from the world through 2 of her senses at once, a child whom absolutely everyone agreed was beyond reach. And he reached her. He taught her language. He taught her to read and write and communicate, to have a mind that could meet other minds. Laura Bridgman became, in the 1840s, one of the most famous people in the world. So famous that when the novelist Charles Dickens travelled to America, he made a point of going to meet her, and then wrote about her for an enormous audience, holding her up as a living proof that the locked rooms behind blindness and deafness could be opened after all. Think about what that meant. A deaf-blind girl became internationally celebrated as evidence that the disabled were not hopeless, and this was decades before Helen Keller, the name we all know, was even born. In fact, the teacher who would later work the famous miracle with Helen Keller came out of that same tradition, trained in the very world that Laura Bridgman's case had opened. The proof had been planted early. The blind could learn. The deaf could learn. The only thing that had ever truly stood in the way was the assumption that they couldn't. And on the strength of that proof, schools for the blind began to spread across the country, state by state, including the one founded in Iowa around the middle of the century, the institution that would, decades later, take in a blind farm girl from the Dakota prairie named Mary Ingalls and hand her back her education, her independence, and her future. Mary never had to invent the possibility of her own learning. Other people, long before her, had fought and won that argument, so that by the time she needed it, the door already existed, and all she had to do was be brave enough to walk through it. She was carried, without ever knowing their names, by a movement of people who had refused to accept that a life like hers was already over. But I want to be honest, because the same century that produced the reformers also produced something much darker, running in the opposite direction. Even as schools for the blind were teaching the disabled to live fuller lives, another current of thought was rising in America, one that looked at people with disabilities and saw not pupils to be educated but defects to be managed, contained, and eventually prevented. In the decades around Mary's life, that colder thinking would harden into the movement that locked many disabled people away in institutions for life, that passed laws to keep them out of sight, and that, at its worst, would come to argue that such people should never be born at all. Mary Ingalls lived her whole life in the narrow, fragile space between those two forces, between the reformers who believed she could be taught, and the hardening belief that people like her were a burden the world would be better without. She landed, by luck and by timing and by the courage of her family, on the right side of that line. The Iowa school existed. The door was open. She walked through it. And the girl the world had quietly given up on was about to learn to read again. Not with her eyes, which were gone for good, but with her hands. I want to slow down on one thing Mary learned at that school, because we say it in passing. She learned Braille, and we move on. And in moving on, we miss what may have been the single greatest gift of her life. She learned to read again, with her hands. Try to feel what that actually means. Mary had been a reader. She had been the studious one, the bright one, the girl who loved her lessons. And when she went blind, the written word, books, letters, scripture, all of it, simply vanished behind a wall. Words are made to be seen. Mary could not see. So for 2 years, the entire world of the written word was closed to her, and for someone who had loved it, that was its own quiet bereavement on top of all the others. And then at the school, they put her fingertips on a page covered in small raised dots and taught her what they meant. The system was the invention of a blind Frenchman named Louis Braille, who as a young man had worked out that the eye could be replaced by the fingertip. That language could be lifted up off the flat page into little patterns of bumps that a reading finger could move across and understand. It was one of the great quiet inventions in human history, and it did something close to a miracle. It gave reading back to people who could not see. By Mary's time, this and 1 or 2 competing systems of raised type were making their way through the schools for the blind, and at Vinton, Mary's hands learned the code. Imagine the moment it first clicks, when the meaningless bumps under your fingers suddenly resolve into a word and then a sentence, and then a thought that someone else put down for you to find. For a girl who had lost the visible world, to discover that she could still read, that books were not gone after all, that she could run her fingers across a line and hear a voice in her mind exactly as she once had with her eyes, that must have been like a window opening in a sealed room. The written word came back to her. She would read for the rest of her life this way with her fingertips, including, in her later years, a Braille Bible that she could open and read entirely on her own, no one else required. The wall came down. Through her hands, Mary could see words again, and there was the music. The school taught her the organ, and Mary did not merely learn it as a sad little accomplishment to keep a blind girl occupied. She became genuinely good. Music, for a blind musician, is a world that asks nothing of the eyes. It lives entirely in the ear and the hands and the memory, 3 faculties Mary had in abundance. At the organ, she was not a blind person being helped along. She was a musician, complete, lacking nothing the music required. It would become over the decades to come, one of the central facts of her life and one of her gifts to other people. It began here, in Iowa, at the keyboard, in the dark. But maybe the deepest thing the school gave her was not Braille or music at all. Maybe it was the simple, enormous relief of being, for the first time since the fever, in a place where she was not the exception. Out in the sighted world, Mary was the blind one, the single person in any room who could not see, the one things had to be arranged around, the one whose difference was always present and always noticed, however kindly. At the school, everyone was blind. Blindness was not the strange thing there. It was simply the shared condition, the ordinary fact of the place. For the first time, Mary was not the girl who couldn't see. She was just a girl, among other girls and boys who lived the way she lived, who knew without being told what it was to map a room by touch, and read a page with a finger and find your way by sound. There were friendships in that, deep ones, the kind that form between people who do not have to explain themselves to each other. Some of those students would grow so close that they married one another after they left. Mary made friends she would keep up with by letter for years afterward, threads of connection to the only people on earth who understood her life completely from the inside. She was homesick, surely. Years are a long time, and the prairie and the family were far away, and a blind girl alone in a distant institution carried a particular kind of loneliness. But she stayed. Year after year she stayed, and learned, and grew, and became more herself, not less. And by the time she stood up at her graduation, and spoke those words about waiting a while and not growing weary, she was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived. She was an educated woman who could read, write, make music, do fine work with her hands, and carry herself through the world. The fever had taken her eyes. The school had given her back nearly everything the eyes had been carrying, and put it, now, into her hands. She went home to Dakota with all of it. And now we come to the strange thing that history did to her. The beautiful lie that was laid over the top of this hard-won, genuine life, and that hid the real woman from the world for the better part of a century. Here is the story the television show told about Mary Ingalls, and I want to tell it to you the way millions of people received it, because for most of the world this is simply what happened to her. In the show, Mary loses her sight as a young woman. In a 2-part episode that broke the hearts of a generation of viewers, she is sent away to a school for the blind, and there, in her darkness, she is not left alone. She meets a man, a fellow teacher, himself blind, named Adam Kendall. They fall in love. They marry. Mary becomes a teacher at the school, shaping young blind lives of her own. She and Adam have a baby. For a while, the blind girl who lost everything has been given a whole new world, a husband, a vocation, a child, a future. And then the show does what that kind of show does. It takes it away. There is a fire at the school, and in that fire, Mary and Adam's baby is killed. It was one of the most devastating hours of television of its era, and people who watched it as children remember it to this day. Later, in another turn of the story, Adam regains his sight after an injury, becomes a lawyer, and he and Mary move away to begin yet another new life in New York. It is a beautiful arc. Love found in the dark, a career, a baby, a tragedy that wrings you out, a second chance. It is exactly the shape of a story we know how to feel all the way through, and now I have to tell you as plainly as I can, not one piece of it happened. There was no Adam Kendall. The man does not appear anywhere in the real life of Mary Ingalls because he was invented for television. Mary never married. Not Adam, not anyone. There was no wedding. There was no baby, which means there was no baby lost in a fire. That grief, which so many viewers carried as if it were real, was written by screenwriters. Mary never became a teacher. She never ran a school. No one's sight was miraculously restored. She never moved to New York, never lived in a city, never had the second act the cameras gave her. The real Mary Ingalls, after she graduated, went home to her parents' house in a small town on the Dakota prairie, and she lived with her family, depending on them and contributing to them, until the day she died. That is the truth. All of the rest was a story laid over the top of her like a beautiful blanket over a plain bed. So here is the question that actually matters, and it is the one I want you to sit with. Why did they do it? Why, when the show's writers came to Mary's adult life, did they look at what really happened, a blind woman, unmarried, living quietly with her family, useful and loved but unspectacular, and decide that they could not show it? Why did they feel they had to give her a husband she never had, and a baby she never bore, and a career she never held, and then kill the baby and restore a man's sight and ship them both off to New York? I do not think it was malice. The people who made that show were earnest, and they loved these characters, and they were not trying to insult anyone. I think the truth is sadder and more revealing than malice. I think they could not bear to leave Mary as she was, because we the audience cannot bear it either. A blind woman whose life is quiet, who does not marry, who does not have children, who does not go out and conquer the world, but stays home, dependent on her family, and fills her days with church and handcraft and small usefulness. That is a real human life. It was Mary's real human life. But it is not a story we know how to clap for. It does not have the shape we've been trained to need. We want the disabled person to be rescued, by love, ideally, or by a cure, or by a triumphant career, because a rescue lets us off the hook. It lets us feel that everything turned out all right. What we cannot easily sit with is a disabled life that is simply lived on its own terms without being fixed, and that is neither a tragedy to be wept over nor a triumph to be cheered, but something quieter and harder to categorize. A life, just a life, lived in the dark and lived anyway. So the writers gave her Adam, they gave her the baby, they gave her the fire and the restored sight and the move to the city, not because Mary needed any of it, but because we did. Because we needed to be told that the blind girl was going to be okay in the ways we understand okay. And in giving her all of that, they quietly erased the actual woman and the actual, unrewarded, genuinely remarkable thing she did, which was to take the narrow life the world allowed her and fill it completely without ever being rescued by anyone. That is the gap. The invented Mary and the real Mary. And I think the real one is the one worth knowing. So let us finally go and meet her in the house she actually lived in, doing the things she actually did, in the town that actually knew her. Picture a house in De Smet, South Dakota, on 3rd Street, where the Ingalls family eventually settled for good. It is an ordinary frame house in an ordinary prairie town, but if you step inside it and look closely, you will see that the whole house has been quietly arranged around the needs of a woman who cannot see. And in those small arrangements is the truth of Mary's life, written more honestly than any television script ever wrote it. Look at the cupboards and the closets. They have been divided up inside, into compartments and sections, so that Mary can reach in and know, by where a thing is, exactly what it is. A place for everything, and everything kept rigorously in its place. Because for a blind woman, order is not tidiness, it is sight. A cup out of position is a cup that has vanished. So the household learned to keep her world fixed and reliable, so that her hands could find what her eyes could not. Now step out into the backyard and look up, and you will see the most quietly moving detail in this whole story. There is a network of ropes strung across the yard. They run from the house out to the garden and onto the outbuildings. They are there so that Mary can go outside by herself, so that she can take hold of a rope and follow it, hand over hand, out to the garden where she could work, or to wherever she needed to go, and find her own way there and back without anyone leading her. A blind woman, alone in a Dakota backyard, moving through the open air under her own power, guided by ropes her family strung for her. That is not the picture of a helpless dependent set quietly in a corner. That is a picture of a person determined to move through her own life on her own, and a family determined to help her do it. And what did she do with that life? She filled it. Mary became the organist at her church, and she held that role for around 30 years. 30 years. Sunday after Sunday, for 3 decades, the music of that congregation came from the hands of a blind woman who had learned to play at a school in Iowa that the world had nearly not let her attend. She taught Sunday school. She was, with her mother, deeply woven into the life of the church, not as the object of the congregation's charity, but as one of the people who held the place together. She joined a youth society, the Christian Endeavour, alongside her sisters Carrie and Grace, and took her place among the young people of the town. She kept up with the friends she had made at the school for the blind, writing to them, staying connected to the small community of people who understood her life from the inside, and she worked with her hands, and her work had value. She did fine beadwork and made lace and sewed. After her father died, she made fly nets, the woven nets that draped over horses to keep the flies off, and those nets brought money into the household. Read that again, because it is the exact thing the world had sworn a blind woman could never do. She earned. She contributed to her own keep. The dependent who was supposed to only ever take took up her needle and her beads and gave back. She read, too, with her fingers, the Braille she had learned, including a Braille Bible that she could open and read on her own. To this day, some of those things survive. Her beadwork, her Braille slate, her Bible, kept in museums, small physical proofs that this life was real and that this woman was here. Not a character, a person who left things behind that you can still go and see. This was Mary's life. No Adam, no fire, no New York, a church organ and ropes across a backyard, and compartmented cupboards, and beadwork that earned, and a Braille Bible read by touch, and a place, a real, held, respected place, in a small community that knew her name. It is not the shape of story we are trained to cheer for, but keep that quiet count I asked you to keep, of what a person can build in the dark when no one is filming. 30 years at the organ, a lifetime of useful hands, a whole self intact in the absence of sight. And through all of it, year after year, the family around her was changing. The people she loved, the ones whose faces she could no longer see and now never would again, were growing old and beginning one by one to leave her. And Mary would live through all of it, every loss, in the dark. There is something about Mary's blindness that almost no one thinks about, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. And it is this. Mary lost her sight in 1879, when she was 14, which means that the last time she ever saw her family's faces, they were the faces of 1879. Her father, Charles, was a man in his early 40s, still dark-haired, still strong. Her mother, Caroline, was not yet old. Her little sisters, Carrie and the baby Grace, were small children. That is the family Mary carried in her mind, frozen, held exactly as they had looked in the last year of light, and never updated again, because she would never see any of them again as long as she lived. Everyone else got to watch their family age. They saw the grey come into Pa's beard, the lines deepen in Ma's face, the little sisters grow tall and become women. Mary saw none of it. For the next 49 years, the people she loved changed completely, grew old, grew grey, grew frail, and in Mary's mind they stayed young, suspended forever in 1879, the way you might keep a photograph that you can never replace. She knew their voices as they aged. She heard her father's step grow slower and her mother's hands grow thinner, but the pictures never changed. She loved a family she could only remember. And then, one by one, that family she could not see began to leave her. Her father went first. In 1902, Charles Ingalls, the man who had told a little girl to be her sister's eyes, the restless father who had dragged them all across half a continent, and finally, at the end, stopped, died in DeSmet, of heart trouble. He was 66, and Mary, who was 37 now and had been blind for 23 years, lost her father without ever having seen his face again after the age of 14. The Pa she grieved was the Pa of the big woods and the prairie, the young father with the fiddle. She had never seen the old man he became. She had only ever heard him get there. After Charles died, Mary and her mother were left together, the two of them, in the house in DeSmet. And they stayed together, mother and blind daughter, for the next 22 years. I have told the story of those long years elsewhere from Caroline's side, and I will not retell it here. But understand Mary's part in it, because it has been overlooked for 100 years. Mary was not simply a sorrow her widowed mother had to tend. Mary was her companion, and in real ways her partner in keeping the household alive. It was Mary at the church organ, week after week. It was Mary's hands, the beadwork, the lace, the fly nets, bringing in money that helped the two women get by after the man of the house was gone. Two women, one of them blind, holding a small life together on the prairie for more than 2 decades. That is not a footnote to anyone else's story. That is its own quiet act of endurance, and Mary carried her full half of it. Meanwhile, her sisters were building lives out in the wider world, the kind of lives Mary herself would never have. Carrie went into the newspaper trade, set type, worked out in the Black Hills, and eventually married and settled in the little town of Keystone. Grace married a farmer and made her home near a place called Manchester. The younger sisters moved outward, into marriages and households and futures of their own, the ordinary expanding life that the world hands to women who can see, and Mary stayed. Mary was the one who remained at home, at the centre with Ma. Not because she was less than her sisters, but because the world had arranged things so that the blind sister was the one who stayed. She held the home. They went out from it, and she loved them across the distance, the sisters she remembered as little girls and could no longer see at all. Then, in 1924, the last and hardest of these losses came. Caroline Ingalls, Ma, died at the age of 84. And with her mother's death, the long centrepiece of Mary's life, the constant companion of those 22 widowed years, was gone. Mary was 59 years old. She'd been blind for 45 years, and now the house she'd lived in, the home she had organised around her own darkness with its compartmented cupboards and its ropes across the yard, was empty of the mother who had been her closest tie to the world. The blind daughter, who was supposed to be cared for, had, in the end, outlived the parents who were supposed to care for her. And now she had to leave the only home that had ever been built to fit her. After her mother's death, Mary went to live with her sister Grace and Grace's husband on their place near Manchester. And then, in time, she went to her sister Carrie, out in Keystone in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the sister who had gone off into the newspaper world and made a life there. The blind woman who had once been sent away alone to Iowa was now carried, in her last years, from one sister's home to another, gently passed along the family that remained, still loved, still kept, but unmoored now from the house and the routines that had been hers. It was at Carrie's home, in Keystone, that the end came. Mary suffered a stroke, and on the 17th of October 1928, with her sister near, Mary Ingalls died of pneumonia. She was 63 years old. She had lived in darkness for 49 years. 49 years. There it is. The whole of it. The number I asked you to hold from the very beginning. 49 years between the fever that took the light and the quiet death in her sister's house. And now you have kept the count with me, and you know what she put into those years. She learned to read again with her fingers. She learned to write again. She made music for a church for 30 years. She made things with her hands that earned their keep. She held half a household together for 2 decades beside her widowed mother. She stayed herself, steady, accomplished, never bitter, the good daughter still, through every loss. All of it endured without ever once seeing the faces of the people she was losing. That is what she built in the dark while no one was filming. That is the count. They brought her body back to De Smet, back to the prairie town where the family had finally, after all the wandering, stopped, and they buried her in the family plot, beside her mother and her father. The eldest daughter, home at last next to the parents she had not seen since she was a girl of 14. And some of what her hands made survived her. Her beadwork, her braille slate, the little tools she used to write, her braille Bible, the one she read by touch. They are kept now in museums, small and patient objects behind glass, not the relics of a character from a television show, but the real possessions of a real woman, the physical proof that she was here, that she could read and make and do, that the verdict the world handed her at 14 was wrong. Remember the words she stood up and recited at her graduation all the way back in 1889, an old Scots phrase from a Robert Burns poem, "Bide a wee and dinna weary, wait a while and do not grow weary." She was 24 when she spoke those words into a room, a blind young woman just setting out into a life the world had told her was already over. And then she went and lived them. She waited. She did not grow weary. For 39 more years she carried a life that should, by every expectation of her time, have crushed her into bitterness, and she did not let it. Bide a wee and dinna weary. It turned out to be a promise, and she kept it to the end. Here is a fact that, once you know it, changes how you feel about everything else. Mary Ingalls died in 1928. The first of the Little House books was not published until 1932. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a moment, because it is quietly devastating. Mary died 4 years before the world ever heard of the Ingalls family. She went to her grave, an obscure blind woman in a small house in the Black Hills, mourned by her sisters and almost no one else, with absolutely no idea of what was coming. She never knew that her little sister Laura would sit down as an old woman and turn their pioneer childhood into books. She never knew that those books would sell in the millions, would be translated around the world, would be read aloud at bedsides for generations, would make the name Ingalls one of the most beloved in American memory. She never knew that she herself would become a character, that children who would not be born for another 50 or 80 or 100 years would grow up knowing the name Mary, the gentle blind sister, and would cry over her. All of it came after her. She missed every bit of it. And there is a deeper ache folded inside that one. Remember what Laura's gift was and where it came from. Laura learned to see for Mary, to turn the visible world into words vivid enough that a blind girl could hold it. That was the gift. And decades later, that exact gift became the books. Which means that Mary was the very first audience for the thing that would one day enchant the whole world. She was the reason the gift was ever developed at all, and she died before it became a single published page. The first person Laura ever learned to paint the world for never got to read the masterpiece that her own blindness had helped create. The books exist in part because of Mary, and Mary never knew there would be books. It gets stranger still, because once Mary became a character, the real woman began to disappear behind her, layer by layer, retelling by retelling. First there were the books. The Mary of the books is drawn with love, and she is closer to the truth than what came later. The patient, good, golden-haired older sister who goes blind and bears it gracefully. But even the books are a shaping, a softening, a selection. They follow the family only through Laura's girlhood and into her early marriage, and then they stop. The long real adult life of Mary Ingalls, the school, the braille, the 30 years at the organ, the fly nets, the decades with Ma, the slow losses, almost none of that is in the books because the books were never about that. So the most famous version of Mary, the literary one, is a real girl, beautifully drawn but frozen in childhood and youth, with her actual life as a grown woman left almost entirely untold. And then, half a century after that, the television show took the softening one enormous step further and simply invented her a life. Where the books had left Mary's adulthood mostly blank, the show filled the blank with fiction. The husband who never was, the baby who never was, the teaching career and the fire and the city, none of it real. And because television reaches further than books, it was the invented Mary, the rescued and married and tragically tested Mary, who lodged most deeply in the public mind. For most people in the world, that fictional woman simply is Mary Ingalls, so look at what happened to her across 100 years. The fever took her sight, the books lovingly froze her in girlhood, and the television show, with the best of intentions, painted a whole false adulthood over the real one and hung it in the public gallery where everyone could see it. At every stage, the actual woman, the The one who learned to read with her hands and made music in the dark and held half a household together and waited and did not grow weary, receded a little further behind the version, until the real Mary was almost completely hidden, present nowhere, replaced everywhere. That is what we are undoing, you and I, tonight. We're taking the versions down off the wall gently, one by one. The frozen girl, the invented wife, and we are letting the real woman stand in the space where she actually lived her life. Because she did live it. All 49 years of it. And she deserves, at least once, to be seen as she truly was by someone who came looking for her, and not for the story. I told you that the real Mary slowly disappeared behind the versions of her. The gentle girl frozen in the books, the invented wife written for television. But the deepest disappearance of all was not a storyline, it was a face. Stop and ask yourself, when you picture Mary Ingalls, what do you actually see? For almost everyone alive, the answer is not the real woman at all. There are barely a handful of photographs of the real Mary. Her actual face, the one that lived 63 years and went blind at 14, is something the world has very nearly forgotten. The face the world sees instead, blonde, blue-eyed, serene, belongs to a young California actress named Melissa Sue Anderson. For 2 or 3 generations of viewers, she is Mary. The real woman's own face has been quietly replaced by the face of the girl who pretended to be her. And the girl who pretended to be her was, in her way, living her own strange version of Mary's story. Melissa Sue Anderson was born in Berkeley, California in 1962, and she was cast as Mary Ingalls in 1974, when she was just 11 years old. She would play the part until 1981, which means she did something Mary's real life never allowed. She grew up, on camera, in front of the entire country, inside the role of the blind sister. When other girls her age were having their first crushes in private, this child actress was receiving handwritten marriage proposals in the mail from fans, some of them younger than she was. When other girls were imagining their first kiss, she was struggling through hers under studio lights in character. She was a real girl, living a public and slightly unreal girlhood, while playing a woman who had lost her sight. She was good at it. In fact, of the entire cast of that long-running, hugely beloved series, Melissa Sue Anderson was the only actor ever nominated for a Primetime Emmy for her work as Mary. She was praised specifically for how truthfully she portrayed a young woman losing her sight and learning to live blind. The fictional Mary's most famous moment, the slow descent into darkness, was carried by a teenager who made it feel real enough to break a nation's heart. And here is the irony that sits at the centre of it. The young woman who became the world's permanent image of Mary Ingalls could not wait to stop being her, because the writers, having taken the real Mary's quiet life and decided it was not enough, kept piling invention upon invention onto the character, and most of those inventions were catastrophes. Over her years on the show piled calamity upon calamity onto the character, invented tragedy after invented tragedy, none of it from the real woman's life. And the actress grew tired of it. She felt by the end that the character had become nothing but a magnet for tragedy, that she was, in her own words, blind and boring, either sitting quietly to one side or being put through some fresh disaster. It had become, she felt, too much like a soap opera. So in 1981, at 19, she walked away from the prairie to look for more serious work, and a few decades later she wrote a memoir looking back on it all. Sit with the shape of that. The single most enduring image of Mary Ingalls in the entire world is the face of a young woman who found the role suffocating and left it behind as soon as she could. The real Mary lived in her blindness for 49 patient years and never once got to walk away from it. The fictional Mary's most famous interpreter escaped her in 7. And it is the one who escaped whose face we all remember. Even the husband they invented for her got a fuller afterlife than the truth did. The actor who played Adam, the blind teacher Mary married, the man who never existed, was a young performer named Linwood Boomer. And after he left the prairie, Boomer went behind the camera and created one of the most successful sitcoms of its era, the long-running comedy Malcolm in the Middle. Think about that. A made-up blind husband invented for a woman who in real life never married became a footnote in the biography of a man who went on to give the world a hit television family of his own. The fiction kept generating more and more life, careers, awards, a whole comedy dynasty, while the real woman it had buried was granted none of it. There is one final strangeness worth sitting with. Melissa Sue Anderson grew up. She left the show at 19, went on with her life, married, had children, eventually settled in Canada, and aged the way every living person ages. The young woman herself moved on. But the Mary she played did not. Somewhere in the world, at nearly every hour, a rerun is playing, and on that screen the teenage face is exactly as it always was, forever young, forever gentle, forever going blind. It is a haunting mirror of the real Mary's own life, where she carried her family frozen in her memory, at the ages they had been the last time she saw them. Here the freezing runs the other way. It is Mary who is frozen now, in a stranger's young face, for everyone except the one woman who actually wore it. The actress grew old. The face called Mary never will and never can. That borrowed face did not float free in the world. It belonged to a machine, a television show so enormous, so beloved and so widely seen that it, more than anything else ever made, is the reason the invented Mary buried the real one. To understand how a quiet prairie woman was so completely rewritten, you have to understand the show that did the rewriting. It was the creation, above all, of one man, Michael Landon. Landon was already a television star when he took up the Ingalls family, and he did not merely act in the show, playing the warm, bearded, idealised Charles, the pa that millions came to love. He was its driving creative force, directing and writing and shaping it across its run, pouring into it his own particular gift for emotional, moral, tear-bringing storytelling. The programme ran on American television for 9 seasons, from the mid-1970s into the early 80s, set in the little Minnesota town of Walnut Grove, and it took the bones of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books and built upon them something that was increasingly its own. And it became, for a generation, a kind of surrogate family for the whole country. There was Melissa Gilbert as the young Laura, the beating heart of the show. There was the actress who played the patient Ma, and the little ones who played Carrie, and, because every beloved family story needs someone to hate, the gloriously wicked Nellie Olson and her dreadful mother, characters viewers loved to despise. There was the young Almanzo who had caught Laura, and there, among them, was Melissa Sue Anderson as Mary, the gentle blind sister. Week after week, year after year, these people came into living rooms across America, felt like kin. But here is the thing you must hold on to. A great deal of what those living rooms were watching simply never happened. The show invented freely. It created whole characters out of nothing. An adopted runaway son the real family never had, the blind husband Mary never married, and others, and folded them in among the real names as though they had always been there. It invented storylines by the dozen. It kept the family settled in Walnut Grove for years longer than the restless real Ingalls family ever stayed anywhere. It reached, again and again, for melodrama the books never contained. The fires, the deaths, the miraculous turns. Over time the show became, in truth, historical fiction wearing a real family's names, warm-hearted, beautifully made, and steadily further from the facts. And none of that would matter very much. It would be just one more loosely true television drama, except for one overwhelming fact. The scale. This show was not a modest success. It was a phenomenon. It was watched by tens of millions in America, and then it went out into the world, dubbed and subtitled and broadcast across continents, adored for decades in countries on the far side of the earth from the Dakota prairie. For an enormous share of the human beings who know the name Ingalls at all, the show, not the books and certainly not the dusty historical record, simply is the Ingalls family. It is where they met them. It is where they live, which means the show's Mary became the world's Mary. The blind girl who married Adam, who lost the baby in the fire, who suffered and endured on screen. that fictional woman walked into hundreds of millions of minds, in dozens of languages, across multiple generations, and settled there as the truth. The real Mary, quiet, unmarried, never a teacher, never in New York, living out her decades on the prairie, had no chance against her. How could she? One was a private woman who left almost no record of herself. The other was a recurring character on one of the most watched television programs in the history of the medium. The invention did not merely defeat the truth, it buried it under a mountain so vast that, for most of the world, the truth was never even visible. I want to be fair to the show, because it was not made in bad faith. Landon and his cast believed in what they were doing. They made something that genuinely moved people, that brought a pioneer family to life for audiences who would never have opened the books, that put a blind young woman at the centre of a beloved drama at a time when disability was rarely seen on screen at all. It did real good. But its very greatness was the problem. The more deeply the world loved the invented Mary, the more completely the real one disappeared. And the show did not simply air and fade. It went into endless syndication, replayed for decades, in country after country, so that children who had not even been born when it first broadcast grew up on it just the same. It shaped how an enormous part of the world pictures the American frontier itself. The covered wagons, the one-room schoolhouse, the killing winters, the tight-knit family against the wilderness. And it shaped, just as powerfully, how that world pictures Mary. For most people who know her at all, there was never any competing image to begin with. They did not read the books first and then see the show. They only ever saw the show. The fictional Mary was not laid over the real one in their minds. She was simply the only Mary who ever arrived. There was nothing underneath for her to cover, because the truth had never reached them at all. And that is what makes the next part of the story so strange. Because the world did not need a television show, or an actress, or an invented husband to remember every blind woman of that era. One of them, a girl born in the very year after Mary lost her sight, made herself one of the most famous human beings who has ever lived, entirely in her own name, with her own voice, and was never once forgotten. Her name was Helen Keller, and her story runs alongside Mary's like a shadow cast the other way. Helen Keller was born in the summer of 1880, the year after the fever took Mary's sight, and when Helen was still a baby, not yet 2 years old, an illness swept through her too, and left her not only blind but also deaf, sealed off from the world through 2 senses at once. On paper, her situation was even more hopeless than Mary's, and yet Helen Keller did not vanish. She became, by the end of her life, perhaps the single most celebrated disabled person in human history, a famous author, a world-travelling speaker, a campaigner who met presidents and moved millions, the subject of films and books still known today. 2 American girls, both blind, both struck down within a year of each other, in the same brief window of history. How did one of them disappear so thoroughly that television had to invent her a life, while the other became immortal in her own name? Part of the answer is something you already know, because I told you about its roots earlier in this story. Remember the reformers, Samuel Gridley Howe, and the school he founded in Boston, and the deaf-blind girl named Laura Bridgman whom he taught to read and write decades before anyone thought it possible, the girl Charles Dickens made famous to the world. That movement, that single stubborn idea that the blind could be educated, is the soil that both of these lives grew out of. It built the schools for the blind that spread across the country, including the one in Iowa that gave Mary back her future. And it reached Helen Keller too, but by a more direct path. When Helen's mother was searching desperately for any hope for her daughter, she read Dickens's account of Laura Bridgman, and that account led the family to Howe's school, and the school sent them a young teacher named Anne Sullivan. Sullivan had trained there. She had studied how Laura Bridgman was taught. She had even known Bridgman herself and learned from her directly. The methods Anne Sullivan used to reach Helen Keller were, in a real sense, handed down from the same source that built Mary's school. So Mary Ingalls and Helen Keller were not strangers in history. They were 2 branches of the very same tree, 2 girls lifted in the same era by the same revolution in how the world treated the blind. They started from the same root, and then their fates split apart completely. Why? Not because one life was worth more than the other. Both were full, real, human lives, and I will not stand here and rank them. The difference was not worth. The difference was voice. And the record, Helen Keller wrote. She published books in her own name, beginning with the story of her own life. She spoke on stages all over the world. She argued, advocated, campaigned, put herself into the public eye and into the historical record again and again, in her own words, by her own choice. She authored her own legend. When history went looking for her, it found a mountain of material that she herself had created. Mary Ingalls did the opposite, and not by any failing of her own. She lived a private life on the prairie, inside her family, inside her church. She left almost no writing of her own, no memoir, no public words, nothing addressed to the wider world. And so, when history went looking for Mary, it found almost nothing in her own hand. Her story survived only because her sister chose to write about her, and then, as you have seen, fiction came along and painted over even that. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth about how the world remembers people. It remembers the ones who speak into the record. Helen Keller spoke, loudly and for decades, and the world kept every word. Mary was silent, content, private, unbothered by fame, and so the world felt free to fill her silence with whatever it liked. A husband, a tragedy, a stranger's face. The same movement gave them both the tools to live. Only one of them used those tools to also be heard. And being heard, in the end, is most of what we mean by being remembered. Consider what Helen Keller actually did with the chance that same movement handed her, because the scale of it is staggering. Deaf and blind from infancy, she learned not only to read and write, but to speak. She went on to college, to Radcliffe, and in 1904 she became the first deaf-blind person in America ever to earn a university degree, and she earned it with honours. She wrote books, beginning with the story of her own life, which has not gone out of print in more than a century. She travelled to dozens of countries across multiple continents. She campaigned decade after decade for the blind, for the poor, for working people, for women's right to vote. She sat with presidents. She made herself, quite deliberately, a public force, and when she died in 1968, the world mourned her as one of its great humanitarians, and through all of it she pointed back again and again to the deaf-blind girl who had gone before her, to Laura Bridgman and the school and the very tradition that had also, on its quieter branch, reached across the prairie and lifted a girl named Mary. Now hold the two of them in your mind at once, as honestly as you can. Helen Keller and Mary Ingalls began at nearly the same terrible disadvantage, within a year of one another, raised up by the very same idea about what the blind could become. One ended as one of the most famous human beings on earth, in her own name, in her own words. The other had to be remembered by a sister, and was then rewritten by strangers who never knew her. And the difference between those two fates was never the size of the soul. It was direction. Helen Keller turned outward, writing, speaking, insisting year upon year on being seen and heard. Mary turned inward, toward her family, her church, her organ, her small and genuine circle, content to be known by the few who loved her, and wholly untroubled by whether the wider world ever knew her at all. Keller laid her hand on the public record and never once lifted it. Mary never reached for it. It would be easy to call that sad. But before you decide, remember what I keep coming back to. Mary did leave something in the record after all, not in words, but in objects, made by her own hands, in the dark. And unlike a face on a screen or a husband in a script, those objects are real. They still exist. You can go and stand in front of them. In a small museum in the town of Mansfield, Missouri, there are a few quiet things behind glass that are perhaps the truest portrait of Mary Ingalls that exists anywhere in the world. Mansfield is where Laura ended up. After all the family's wandering, Laura and her husband settled at last on a farm there, And it was in that house, as an old woman, that Laura wrote the books. And it was there she died in 1957 at the age of 90. The house and the museum beside it have become a gathering place for everything the family left behind, and among the treasures kept there are objects that belonged not to Laura, but to her blind older sister. There is Mary's braille slate, the small tool she used to write, pressing out the raised dots by touch. There is her braille Bible, the very kind of book she read with her fingertips, the scripture she could open and move through entirely on her own, needing no one's eyes but her own hands. And there is her beadwork, the fine, patient handcraft she made, the same kind of skilled work that, after her father died, helped bring money into the home, down the long pilgrimage trail in De Smet where the family finally settled. More of their things are kept, the family's home, Pa's fiddle, the ordinary furniture of their days. Now hold these objects up against everything we've just talked about. The world's image of Mary is a borrowed face on a television screen. The world's memory of her is a fictional husband and a baby who died in a fire and a move to New York. None of it real. That version of Mary is loud, and it is everywhere, and it is false. And then there is this, a slate, a Bible, and a handful of beads, sitting in a quiet room in Missouri. They are not a story laid over her. They are not an actress's interpretation or a writer's invention. They are hers. She touched them. She used them. She made them. They are the small, stubborn, surviving facts of a real life. Proof, in a way nothing on a screen can ever be, that there was a woman here, that she could read and write and make beautiful things, that she did all of it without sight, and that she was real. And there is something almost unbearably moving in their being on display at all. Mary made the beadwork by touch. She read the Bible by touch. She wrote on the slate by touch. She never once saw any of these things with her own eyes. Not the colours of the beads, not the pages of the Bible, not the marks she pressed into the slate. And now, more than a century later, sighted strangers file slowly past the glass and look at them. The things her hands made in the dark are finally out in the light, being seen by everyone except the woman who made them. She gave the world these objects without ever beholding them herself. It is the same shape as her whole life. She gave and gave in a darkness she never escaped, and the seeing was always left to someone else. There are other quiet treasures in that Missouri museum that deepen the picture beyond Mary's own things. There is the family Bible, with the births of the Ingalls children entered in careful, flowing script, Mary's own name and birthday among them, set down by a hand that loved her, in a book the family carried through every single move across the country. There is Pa's fiddle, the very instrument whose music runs like a thread through all the stories, the fiddle Mary heard on countless evenings she could no longer watch being played, the sound that, for her, became one of the shapes of home. To stand in front of these things is to feel the whole distance between the legend and the life collapse at once, because these are not stage props built to look old. They are the actual, ordinary, almost holy objects of a real family's real days, and the visitors come, in a steady stream, year upon year to see them, driving across whole states to stand for a few silent minutes before a fiddle, a Bible, and a blind woman's beadwork. Something in people needs the real thing. They need to know that underneath the famous books and the beloved television show there were actual human beings who actually lived, and that here, behind this glass, is the proof you can stand before with your own eyes. And of everything in those cases, Mary's small objects may be the most quietly powerful of all, precisely because they ask so little and prove so much. These quiet objects sit at the end of a long road, a road that thousands of people travel every year, across half a continent to walk where this family walked, and that road leads above all to the one place this restless family finally, permanently, stopped. There is a pilgrimage, and it is real, and people make it from all over the world. It runs from Peepin in the Wisconsin woods where Mary and Laura were born, westward through Walnut Grove in Minnesota, through Burr Oak in Iowa, down to Independence in Kansas, and to De Smet in South Dakota, and finally to Mansfield in Missouri. the whole long scattered map of a family that could never seem to stay in one place. At each stop there is something to see: a replica cabin, a restored home, a one-room schoolhouse, a museum, the actual ground where the actual family actually lived. Every summer, in more than one of these towns, there are outdoor pageants performed on the open prairie, the family story acted out under the same kind of sky they lived beneath. Strangers come from across America and across oceans to stand in these places and feel, for a moment, that they have stepped into the world of the books. And of all these places, De Smet holds the heart of it, because De Smet is where the wandering finally ended. After all the moving, all the failed farms and the long winters and the towns left behind, this is where the family put down roots that held. It is where they stayed, and it is where Mary is buried in the family plot beside her mother and her father. Think about what that means for her specifically. Mary's last years, as you know, were spent without a home of her own, passed gently from her sister Grace's house to her sister Carrie's house, a blind woman in her 60s carried along by the family that remained, never again with a place that was simply, fully hers. She died a guest in someone else's home, and now, in death, she is the opposite of unmoored. She lies permanently in one fixed place, in marked ground, tended and visited, beside the parent she had not seen since she was a girl of 14. People come from the other side of the world to stand quietly at that family plot. The blind girl who spent her last years being moved from house to house is at last somewhere she will never be moved from again. And she is not alone there. There is a gentle justice in it. The family that could not stop running is now the most settled family imaginable, fixed forever on the map, in towns that exist in part to remember them. The roots they never quite managed to grow in life, they have grown and deep and permanent in memory. And Mary, who left so little of her own voice behind that the world had to invent one for her, draws strangers across continents simply because she belonged to this family, and this family mattered. She is remembered and tended and kept. Walk the whole route, and you can nearly trace the family's restless life with your own feet. In Peepin, the woods where Mary and Laura were born. In Walnut Grove, the banks of Plum Creek, and a summer pageant performed each year on a hillside built for it. In Burr Oak, the very hotel the family once kept, still standing on its original ground. Near Independence, a one-room cabin like the one Pa raised on the Kansas prairie. And in De Smet and in Mansfield, the actual homes, the actual furniture, the museums full of the actual things. People plan their vacations around this trail. They bring their children along it. They come from the far side of the world, from Japan, from across Europe, from everywhere the books and the show ever reached, to stand in these plain little places and feel the stories turn real beneath their feet. But the strangest part of Mary's long afterlife is not the graves, or the pageants, or the objects behind glass. It is what happened to the living, the people she left behind when she died in 1928, and the enormous wave of fame that rolled in for them, just a few years too late for Mary to ever know it had come. When Mary died in the autumn of 1928, she died in obscurity. No one beyond her family and her small circle had any reason to know her name, and the same was true of all of them. The Ingalls family at that moment was simply one more pioneer family that had lived hard and quiet lives on the American frontier, and was now passing one by one out of the world and into forgetting. That is what should have happened to them. It is what happened to almost every family like them. It is not what happened. The younger sisters went first into the years after Mary. Grace, the baby of the family, died in 1941. Carrie, who had gone off into the newspaper world and made her own life in the Black Hills, died in 1946. The little girls Mary had carried in her frozen memory, the children she could no longer see, grew old and passed, as everyone does. But Laura lived on. Laura lived until 1957, to the great age of 90. And Laura lived just long enough to watch the impossible happen. She lived to see the books she wrote in her old age, the simple stories of her pioneer childhood, become a national treasure. She lived to see children all over the country reading them, loving them, learning the family's names by heart. She lived to receive, as an old woman, the recognition and the fame and the flood of devoted letters that her sister Mary never knew existed. The obscure prairie family became, through Laura's pen, one of the most beloved families in the whole of American memory. And now feel, one more time, the weight of the thread I asked you to carry from the very beginning. Laura, the little sister who, in a grieving house in 1879, was told to be Mary's eyes, to look at the world and turn it into words so a blind girl could still have it. That little sister grew up to be celebrated across the world for exactly that gift, the describing, the seeing out loud. The reward came, in full, to Laura, and the reason the gift ever existed, Mary, whose blindness made the describing necessary in the first place, was 4 years in her grave before the first book was even published, and 3 decades gone before the family's fame reached its height. Laura, who learned to see for Mary, was given the world for it. Mary, who was the reason, was given the dark, and then a stranger's face on a television screen she would never see. The fame only grew after Laura was gone. Her daughter, herself a writer, helped carry the legacy forward. The books spread across the globe, translated into language after language, and then a television show in the 1970s and 80s carried the family to hundreds of millions of people who had never read a word of the books. Every member of that once-forgotten family became immortal. Pa, Ma, Laura, Carrie, Grace, even the baby brother who died at 9 months and never appeared in the stories at all. Strangers the world over now know them, mourn them, love them. And Mary is among them. The most obscure of them all in life, the blind, unmarried sister passed between houses at the end, who left almost nothing of her own voice, became, through her sister's words and a screen she never saw, one of the most famous blind women in the world, without ever knowing it. Largely as a person she never actually was. It is the strangest immortality imaginable, to be remembered everywhere and recognized nowhere, to be one of the best-known blind women in history, and to have your real face, your real life, your real self, almost completely forgotten underneath the legend. It is worth pausing on how the books even came to exist, because it only sharpens the ache. Laura did not set out as a young woman to become a famous author. She was already in her 60s, living quietly on the Missouri farm when she began setting down the stories of her pioneer girlhood, encouraged at first, and then helped, by her daughter Rose, who was by then an established writer in her own right, and who worked with her mother to shape the memories into books. The first of them appeared in 1932, and over the years that followed, the rest came one after another, until the entire arc of the family's journey, the big woods, the open prairie, the long winters, the little towns, had been turned into a series that would be cherished for generations. Laura wrote them as an old woman, looking back across more than half a century, at a family most of whom were already gone. And Mary was already gone. 4 years in the ground before the first page appeared, never knowing any of it was coming. When Laura wrote the gentle blind sister back to life on the page, she was writing an elegy, a memorial for someone who would never know she had been remembered. And the books spread the way almost no books ever do. They crossed oceans. They were translated into language after language. They became a fixture of childhood in countries that had never seen a prairie or a covered wagon. And then, decades after Laura's own death in 1957, the television show carried the family further still, into the hundreds of millions. The obscure pioneer family that should, by every ordinary rule of history, have slipped away without a trace, became instead one of the most widely known families on the entire earth. And the quietest, most private, most easily forgotten of them all. The blind sister who left no public words behind her was swept up into that immortality with the rest, known and mourned and loved by strangers the world over who had no idea how little of the real woman they were truly holding. But to feel the full weight of where Mary's story finally comes to rest, you have to understand something she herself never lived to see. How completely the world transformed for people exactly like her in the 100 years after she was gone. A century of change that she missed by the width of a hair. Mary Ingalls died in the autumn of 1928, and she died inside the old world. The world that had passed its hard verdict on her when she was 14 and never once revised it. To the day of her death, the settled belief about blindness was the same one we looked at near the beginning of this story. That a blind person was a dependent, finished, set quietly aside, incapable of work or independence or a full life in the world. Mary spent her entire life under that verdict. She was born too soon to live under any other. And here is the part that will sit with you. Almost the very moment she died, that world began to break apart, and nearly everything it had sworn was impossible for someone like her became, within a few decades, perfectly ordinary. Look at the timing. The year after Mary died, 1929, the first school in America for training guide dogs opened its doors, and suddenly a blind person could be paired with an animal, trained to lead them safely through streets and crowds and strange places, walking the world on their own. In those same years, the simple white cane became a recognized tool and symbol of the independent blind traveller, a way to move through the world unaided that spread across the country. In the 1930s, entire books began to be recorded for blind readers, talking books, so that a blind person could once again have access to all of literature, not by touch this time, but by ear. And in the same era, the Braille system was at last standardized, so that a blind reader anywhere could read the same dots as any other. The locked rooms were being opened, one after another, just a little too late for Mary to walk into any of them, and it kept going, across the whole long century of her absence. Blind people went to universities and earned degrees. They took up professions, they married, raised children, lived alone in their own homes, travelled the world, did, in short, every single thing that the world of 1879 had looked at a blind 14-year-old and declared forever out of reach. In 1990, the country wrote into its very laws a promise that disability would no longer mean exclusion, that the world itself would be reshaped, with ramps and access and accommodation, so that people like Mary would not be shut out of it. And then came the machines, devices that could read any printed page aloud, computers that could speak their screens, telephones built to be used without sight at all. Tool after tool, right after right, each one quietly overturning the verdict that had defined Mary's entire life. She saw none of it. Feel the cruelty of that timing one more time, because it is the same shape that has haunted this whole story. The books that made her family immortal were published 4 years after she died. The fame that crowned them crested decades after she was gone. And the revolution that would have transformed her own daily life, the dogs, the canes, the talking books, the rights, the machines, arrived, in earnest, just after she had lived and died, without any of it. Mary Ingalls belonged to the very last generation of the old world. She died on the doorstep of the new one and never got to step through. If she'd been born even a generation later, her life might have looked unrecognisably different, fuller, freer, more her own. She was, in the end, a woman the calendar was cruel to, again and again, missing every rescue by a hair. But I do not want to leave you there, because there is a turn in this, and it is the gentlest and most surprising turn of all. Because for all the dogs and canes and recordings and laws and machines that the New World invented, the deepest help it ever rediscovered for a person who cannot see turned out to be the oldest and simplest thing in the world, older than any of the inventions, as old as human kindness itself. It is not a device, it is another person. A person willing to look at the world and to say, out loud and with care, what they see, so that the one who cannot see is not shut out of it. And that, exactly that, is the thing Mary already had. In 1879, in a lamplit house on the Dakota prairie, from her sister, long before any school, any dog, any cane, any law, any machine, a blind girl had the one thing that would turn out to matter most, someone to be her eyes. The whole modern world, with all its wonders, spent 100 years circling back to the simple act of love that a grieving family had improvised at a wooden table before any of it existed. And the most remarkable of all those modern wonders, the one that took that simple act and gave it to the entire human race, arrived in our own century. It carries a name, and if you have been listening to this story from the beginning, that name is going to stop you where you sit. Earlier in all of this, I told you about the thing that may matter most in Mary's entire story. The small, world-changing arrangement that began in those first dark weeks. How her father told her little sister Laura to be Mary's eyes, to look hard at the world and describe it out loud, so that a girl who could no longer see it might still somehow be given it. I even gave that part of the story its own name. I called it Be My Eyes. I want to tell you now that those exact words have come back into the world, and that what one sister did for another in one small house more than a century ago is now being done millions of times, every day, all over the earth. In 2015, more than 130 years after that spring on the prairie, a visually impaired craftsman in Denmark named Hans-Jørgen Wiberg launched something he had been turning over in his mind for years. Wiberg was losing his own sight to a slow disease, and he understood from the inside the particular frustration of the small tasks. Reading a label, checking whether the milk had spoiled, telling whether your clothes matched, finding the thing you had dropped. That sight makes effortless, and blindness makes impossible. And he had a simple, beautiful idea. Everyone now carried a phone with a camera that could make a live video call. What if a blind person could point that camera at whatever was in front of them, and a sighted stranger somewhere in the world could simply look through it and tell them what was there? What if they could, for a moment, borrow someone else's eyes? He called the app Be My Eyes. Within a single day of its launch, 10,000 volunteers had signed up to lend their sight. Within a few years, there were millions of them. Today, many millions of sighted volunteers in more than 180 languages available within seconds. A blind person almost anywhere can now open this app and in moments be connected to a real human being who will look at the world on their behalf and describe it, read the letter aloud, find the keys, say what the sign says, tell them what is there. The whole purpose of the thing, its entire reason for existing, is the oldest and simplest act of kindness there is: to look at the world for someone who cannot, and to say what you see. Now hold that against where this story began. In 1879, a blind girl on the Dakota prairie had exactly one person on earth to be her eyes. Her sister, by voice, by love, in one small lamplit house. That was the whole network. One girl describing the world to another, because there was no one and nothing else. Today, a blind person has a world full of strangers ready to do the same. A tap away, in almost any language, at almost any hour. The thing that Laura did for Mary, look at the world and say what you see, so that the one in the dark is not shut out of it, has become one of the largest acts of shared human kindness on the planet, performed millions of times over by people who have never heard the name Mary Ingalls and never will. But Mary and Laura were there first, a grieving family on the frontier with no map and no guidance, simply improvising a way to keep a blind girl tied to the world she could no longer see. And in doing so, without the faintest idea of it, they were rehearsing in miniature the very thing the whole world would one day reach for. Mary's small private darkness, and the patient love that answered it across a wooden table by lamplight, turned out to be a quiet first draft of something enormous. The future was already happening in 1879 in that little house. It just had an audience of one. So, no. Mary's story does not end in a grave in De Smet, or in a glass case in Missouri, or on a television screen with a stranger's face. It is still going. It is going every single time someone, somewhere, borrows a stranger's eyes to see the world. Every time a person who cannot see is told gently, what is there? The thing she and her sister made between them never died. It just grew until it belonged to everyone. And there is one last layer to it, fitting for our own age. The man who built Be My Eyes, Hans-Jørgen Wiberg, was himself slowly losing his sight to a disease that narrows a person's vision year by year. He was building in part for a darkness he knew was coming for him. He made the very thing he would one day need. And in time, the app grew beyond even its volunteers. It added an artificial intelligence that can look through the phone's camera and describe the world on its own, in an instant, with no other human required. So now we have built machines to be the eyes of the blind. But the machines came last. Before the AI, before the millions of volunteers, before the app itself, there was the original and simplest version of all. One person, looking at the world for another and saying gently what they see. A girl at a wooden table in 1879, telling her blind sister what the prairie looked like. Everything since has only been that same small act of love, multiplied until it reached the whole world. And that is why, before I finally let her go, I want to give you back the 3 things I asked you to carry, all the way back at the very beginning, in the dark. I asked you, at the very beginning, to hold on to 3 things. We have carried them the whole way. Let me give each one back to you now. The first was the number. 49 years in the dark, and you no longer need me to tell you what it means, because you have watched it fill day by day and decade by decade with reading and music and handcraft and endurance and love. 49 years is not the length of a tragedy. It is the length of a life, a full one, lived without the one thing we assume a person cannot live without, and lived anyway. The second was the little sister, Laura. The girl her father told to be Mary's eyes, and here, at the end, is the full weight of that, the thing I promised we would come back to, because Laura learned to see for Mary, to look hard at the world and turn it into words clear enough that a blind girl could walk into them, and that exact gift, forged in that exact grief, became, decades later, the gift that wrote the Little House books. Which means that when a child anywhere in the world opens one of those books and suddenly sees the big woods of Wisconsin, or the endless grass of the open prairie, or the white terror of a Dakota blizzard, or the warm yellow lamplight of a little house holding back the night, that child is seeing it through eyes that first learned to see on Mary's behalf. The whole world's picture of the American frontier was painted, at its root, by a sister trying to give the view to a girl who had lost it. Mary never saw those books. She died before most of them were written. But they exist, in part, because she went blind. Her darkness is the lens the entire world has used to picture that lost America. Sit with that. It may be the strangest and most beautiful fact in this whole story. And the third thing was the question, the one I refused to answer. Was Mary's real life, blind, unmarried, lived out quietly in her family's houses, a small and sorrowful and shrunken thing? Or was it a triumph that simply nobody thought to celebrate? I told you I would not answer it for you, and I am going to keep that promise. But I will say this, now that you have seen the whole of it, the television writers looked at Mary's real life and decided it was not enough. So they gave her a husband, and a baby, and a fire, and a city, and a rescue, because they could not imagine that a quiet, single, blind woman's actual life could be worth showing as it was. That was their answer. They thought she needed to be more than she was. You have now seen who she actually was. A girl the world wrote off at 14, who learned to read with her hands and make music in the dark and earn her own keep, with beadwork and hold half a home together, and outlive almost everyone she loved without ever seeing their faces age, and who did all of it without growing bitter, and who waited and did not grow weary. Maybe that is a constrained and sorrowful life. Or maybe it is one of the quietest triumphs anyone in that whole famous family ever managed, the one nobody filmed, because it does not have the shape we're trained to clap for. I have laid the real Mary in front of you, all of her as honestly as I can. What you make of her is yours to decide. But here is the last thing, and I want to leave you with it. They could take Mary's sight. They could not take Mary. And for 100 years a fairy tale stood in front of the real woman and hid her. The invented wife, the invented mother, the invented teacher in the invented school. Tonight, for a little while, we moved the fairy tale aside and let the real one stand where she actually stood. At a church organ on the Dakota prairie, her hands sure on the keys, making music she would never see the faces moved by. following a rope across a backyard, out to her garden, under a sky she could not look at, finding her own way there and back, alone and unafraid. She was seen tonight, by you, finally and truly as she really was, and as long as someone is willing to look at the real woman instead of the comfortable story, to see her exactly as she was and to find it remarkable, then Mary Ingalls, who spent 49 years in the dark, is not in the dark at all. Thank you for staying with her all the way to the end. These are the quiet ones, the lives the bright versions paint over, and it means something that you sat with her and saw her through all of it. If she stayed with you, if the real woman behind the story stayed with you, then there is more history like this waiting here, the kind that lifts the legend gently aside to show you the truer thing underneath. I'll bring you the next one. Until then, rest easy. The house is quiet, the lamp is low, and somewhere on the prairie a woman who could not see has been seen and remembered and is not alone.